Alright folks, you know the drill. 5 games, they're all under 5 hours, they're all indies, and I'm here to pitch you on why you should spend your weekend playing them. First up, If on a Winter's Night for Travelers. That's a mouthful of a title, but If on a Winter's Night for Travelers is a point-and-click adventure with some absolutely gorgeous artistic flourishes. Just check this out. And yeah, sure, you've probably heard that pitch 100 times before, but Winter's Night is a lot more than just a pretty pixel job. It's also backed up by a pretty unique set of mini-narratives. It's not really a game that translates to an elevator pitch particularly well, but here goes. A bunch of people randomly show up on a mysterious and creepy train with no idea of how they got there and share their life stories, which make up the real meat of the game. In actual structure, it's a collection of tragic short stories with a healthy dolloping of psychological horror, running the gamut from a gay couple's tryst in Rome that immediately goes off the rails, to a doctor's horrifying spirit journey into some real Lovecraftian shit. But that's kind of a sanitized description. It doesn't really quite sell it. This one likes to get dark. Real dark. Like, all the content warnings dark. Super hardcore homophobia, racism, addiction, suicide, both personal and assisted. This game covers some extremely sensitive topics, and it's entirely unflinching in doing so. None of these short stories have a happy ending, but I think it does a good job covering these topics respectfully. It's not just a bunch of cheap shock horror, but instead is ultimately a mature exploration of these various dark and incredibly heavy topics through the lens of these little 30-minute vignettes of the main characters' lives. Some of them come with an interesting mechanical twist to really put you in the character's headspace, and some just leave your jaw on the floor going, holy shit, they actually went there. But regardless, each of Winter's Night's little vignettes have their own deeply fascinating appeal, and if you can handle the heavier subject matter, it's definitely worth checking out. Unpacking. Gaming's got its fair share of busywork games. Games where you voluntarily show up to relax by basically doing chores. Mopping floors, painting walls, that sort of thing. The latest in this trend of games is Unpacking, an extremely pretty game all about sorting out your stuff. Stack books on shelves, get your cutlery in the drawers, and get all your clothes out of a box and up on some hangers. People have been raving about it for months, possibly because of its comfy aesthetic or because of its weirdly satisfying gameplay. That, or they just like getting to live out the fantasy of homeownership. I don't know, I can understand the appeal. Beyond the absolutely gorgeous pixel art, Unpacking's big claim to fame is a narrative told entirely through the stuff we bring with us. The stuffed animal that's gone through 20 years of history with you, the degree you proudly display up on your wall. It's a lot of narrative design told entirely through context clues, and it's not really something you're going to see anywhere else. But the story Unpacking tells with all these environmental cues is... There are a lot of fun details you can pick up, both large and small, about the main character. Oh hey, she got big into tabletop games. Aw, her favorite mug got chipped, but she kept it. Seeing how different items travel alongside the main character over the years is genuinely interesting, but the overarching story all these details contribute to never gets any further than the surface level. It largely relies on big cultural touchstones it can expect most people to pick up on, creating a story that's certainly universal, but not particularly memorable. You can already feel the limits of the format a little bit. The one thing the game does do a good job of, though, is putting you into the character's headspace, as you have to find ways to cram your life around everybody else's stuff. This particularly hit me when she moved in with a boyfriend. I instantly hated this guy just because he left absolutely no room in his apartment for his girlfriend, like, anywhere, and it produced the one real emotional response I got out of the game. Honestly, I'm not quite as sold on this being Game of the Year material as a lot of people I know. I mostly enjoyed this game from a technical perspective. I nerded out about Unpacking more than I traditionally enjoyed it, but you know, nerding out is still a form of enjoyment, so that counts as a good time. It's a cool experimental game taking a crack at telling a narrative in a different and uniquely video gamey way, has some absolutely gorgeous pixel art, and the mundanity of stacking books on shelves for an hour is a weirdly zen experience. It's worth a look. The Forgotten City. It takes all of about 5 minutes for Forgotten City to throw you into the thick of it. Just a trip down a trapdoor into some spooky ruins and a waltz through a conspicuous portal, and you're right in the middle of an ancient Greco-Roman town filled to the brim with mysteriously lifelike golden statues. Huh. They move. Wonder what that's about. you're also thrown right into the thick of a pretty tense political situation. See, the Forgotten City has some supernatural force that enforces 2 rules. 1, dubbed the Golden Rule, see what they did there. And 2, if one person screws up, they ruin it for everybody. And that's raised a lot of questions about the law. What all constitutes the Golden Rule? What laws should be enforced? How do you maintain a society where the laws it's founded on are utterly immutable and don't allow for context? And of course, you've shown up on election day when all those questions are coming to a head and all the problems that have festered in the town are starting to boil over. So it's time to get to fixing. The Forgotten City is basically an adventure game meet open world exploration title. Hunt around, talk to people, solve their problems, and find the right items tucked away in the corners of the map to progress the main plot. Get far enough along and you'll catch the scent of a grand mystery connecting everything else going on in the little mountain town, and get a few hours further and that mystery will start unfolding with numerous satisfying dramatic reveals. Forgotten City's got a pretty dang interesting plot, but what ended up sticking with me is all the philosophy the game espouses along the way. The titular city is basically a giant philosophy thought experiment, and every character existing in it has a pretty strong opinion on how that grand experiment is going, as well as a lot of commentary on cultures and how they build on top of each other. The writing on this one is really exceptional. If you have any love for adventure games, want a game that digs into some heavy philosophical themes, or just like yourself a good old mystery, you owe it to yourself to pick this up. Rogue Fable 3. You like roguelikes? I don't mean that kind of roguelike. No, not that kind either. I'm talking about roguelikes. Games that play like Rogue. Your Dungeons of Dreadmore and your Cog Mines. These games can be a ton of fun. Nerdy dives into obsessively detailed dungeons where the fact you have no idea what's going on and have to figure out how things work as you go is a selling point. But they're also sprawling affairs. A single run can take like 40 hours, and that's assuming you get it right the first time. Spoilers, you won't get it right the first time, and even if you do, there are multiple classes and tons of randomized dungeons to keep you playing forever. And forever's a long damn time. But Rogue Fable 3 bucks that trend, translating all that roguelike goodness into an experience that only takes an hour or 2 a run. How does it accomplish this feat, you ask? Mostly through some really nice quality of life things, like the fact you can fast forward almost instantly around the dungeon with a single mouse click, which really cuts down on dead time. However, the maps are also just a wee bit smaller than some of these other sprawling dungeons, which also contributes to the low runtime. Vertically, the dungeons are just as deep as any other roguelike, but horizontally, you can breeze through a floor in 5 minutes. I'll admit that Rogue Fable doesn't have quite the same life to it as some other roguelikes. It's fairly generic fantasy fare, a little lacking in the personality department, and it doesn't have any of the really out there ideas you'll find in some other games. But it nails what it needs to be fun. Builds are interesting, particularly once you start mix and matching skills from different classes and playing some of the wackier races. The combat itself is surprisingly deep for something so light, and the game has a ton of biomes to explore that it swaps out every run. It's everything you need to get that same dungeon crawly experience, and unlike a lot of its competition, you might actually find enough time in the day to actually see the end of the game. Heavenly Bodies. Heavenly Bodies is one of those games all about making basic functional movement as complex and obtuse as humanly possible. In this case, you control each limb separately, with additional buttons for gripping things with each hand, and yes, it gets about as confusing as you'd think. That's the point. But Heavenly Bodies' big twist is that you're doing this all in space, in zero gravity. Yep, this is exactly the slapstick nonsense you'd expect, where the smallest mistake can quickly spiral into you careening wildly across the space station, helplessly waving your arms around. The way these games can reduce you to a complete bumbling clown is always a good time, especially if there's a crowd to revel in it, which Heavenly Bodies conveniently allows with a 2-player mode. Heavenly Bodies is also one of the most inventive games of its class I've ever seen. Every scenario is cooler than the last and introduces completely new mechanics. Building a satellite, growing plant life, for God's sakes, there's a mission where you jump into a rocket pod and go flying through an asteroid field. There are a ton of delightfully dangerous missions you have to do, each easier to balls up than the last. The sheer amount of creativity alone in the cool scenarios the game puts you through is enough to get it on this list. All of this can be a bit of a double-edged sword, though, because having all of these increasingly complex scenarios means that Heavenly Bodies expects a lot of you. In a lot of other games like Heavenly Bodies, the stakes are incredibly low with very simple objectives, But here, you have end goals that are both more complex and require some pretty precise movements to execute. You have to manipulate tools, plug components in, and somehow find a way to crank pulleys without sending yourself spiraling off into space with the force of your own cranking. Now, the game struggles a little bit with its zero-G environment. Once you start flipping all over the place, the game doesn't quite know whether to orient your controls to the direction of your body or the camera, making already obtuse and complicated controls now inconsistent as well. Maybe your arms will do what you want them to do. Maybe they'll just make things worse and send you spiraling off into space. The devs seem to be aware of this issue and have dedicated an entire button to recentering your camera, which solves a lot of the control issues. But I resisted this for the longest time, thinking I'd get hopelessly turned around with my camera spinning every which way, and I was not enjoying myself. Just having a fruitless, deeply frustrating time actively wrestling against the game's controls, never knowing exactly what was going to happen when I hit a button, which can be very frustrating when the game asks you to do fairly precise things like manipulating tools or wave your arms around to build momentum. After 10 minutes of dragging myself around trying to open this goddamn box with a crowbar, it sometimes felt like I was just bashing my face against a problem until I got lucky and the game took pity on me. But when I finally caved and started hitting the camera button every 5 seconds, Heavenly Bodies became a much more enjoyable game with significantly more intuitive controls, and I started having a lot of fun. The devs probably could have impressed this fact upon me a bit more insistently, but I actually managed to find a way to play a game wrong, and it nearly ruined the entire game for me. So don't make my mistake. Learn to love the camera button, and the game just runs so much better. But aside from that one piece of advice I wish somebody had told me when I started, Heavenly Bodies is actually a pretty fun game with a lot of great ideas kicking around in it. It's a little on the rough end, but its charm and creativity still wins out in my mind. Give it a shot. So that's everything I've got this time, but if you like short games like these, stick around. There's plenty more where that came from. And don't forget to hit up the Patreon. If you enjoyed the video enough to get all the way here, you should go throw money at it. But thank you for watching all the way through. I hope you enjoyed this quarterly wrap-up, and I'll see you all next time.